Hello everybody and welcome to another Apologetics Friday, and this week we're talking about if God is so good, why is there evil? And we're just going to start at the beginning. So we're going to start in Genesis 3. I'm just going to kind of give you the rundown of everything that happened because that would be a lot to read. So basically, in the beginning of everything, God created the heavens and the earth. He created everything within the earth, and he also created man, male and female. And we see that not long after he created male and female and everything, man chooses to sin. And so we see that in Genesis 3 in the Garden of Eden. And how this came about was that God told Adam and Eve, he said, you can eat from any tree in this garden that I've given you, but you cannot eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so then the serpent came, aka Satan, and tempted Eve to eat the fruit from the tree, saying, no, like God just told you not to do that because you'll be like God, you'll know good and evil. And so he tempted Eve to eat the fruit, and Eve did. She could have chosen not to, but she did. She chose to disobey what God had said, and she ate the fruit, and then Adam ate the fruit also. And so this is where we see the presence of sin enter the world and enter just our lives. And from this, every person on the earth, has the nature of sin. We all sin. Everybody falls under this umbrella. Nobody is exempt from it. And so we see that man went from having this perfect standing with God to now sinning and disobeying God's command. And now, because of this sin, we all deserve death and eternity apart from God. And just sin is basically anything. A lot of the things that we think of as like murder, lying, stealing, like cheating, and all of these terrible things. But it also includes things like pride and coveting and gossip and being jealous over other people's things, and like manipulating and all of these things. Even to the smallest things that we don't consider to be as bad, they still fall under that umbrella of sin because they are disobeying what God has told us to do. And so from this we see that man chose to sin against God, man chose to disobey God's commands, and God allowed this to happen. God didn't make Adam and Eve into robots who did everything that they told them. He could have, but he didn't. And I think that this is because if you make someone into a robot and you make them do what you want them to do, that isn't love. That isn't someone choosing to love you. So God allowed this to happen. But we see whenever he's talking to them that he says that he will not let evil stay around. He will not let sin stay. He will not just turn a blind eye to it, but that it will be dealt with. And all things will be judged. And I want to fast forward a little bit to the end of Genesis, to Genesis 37 and 39 through 50. To the story of Joseph, which is personally one of my favorites because I just love it. I think it's awesome. And we see later in Genesis this man named Joseph. And basically, this is a guy, fairly good guy. He's awesome. And we see that he gets sold into slavery at the age of 17, which is honestly pretty young. Like, that's crazy. He gets sold into slavery by his brothers because his brothers are mad at him. They're jealous of him just because he's a favorite of his father. So they sell him into slavery to Egypt by his brothers. And as he goes there, he is tempted and tried. First of all, he's sold by his own family and betrayed. And then he goes to Egypt, and he is working in this man's house, like this high official's house, and he does everything right. He's a righteous man, but he is still blamed for things that he didn't even do. And so then he is thrown into prison for a couple years, and he still obeys God. He still follows God's commands. And I'm trying to see. But from this, we see that God still used Joseph. And in the end, Joseph actually becomes second in command over Egypt, but that took like 13 whole years, maybe even a little bit longer. And so we see that God did allow this to happen to Joseph. And yes, Joseph was a righteous man. He did follow the Lord, but these things still happen. So no one is exempt from that. But in the end, we see that God used Joseph to save God's people and he brought his people to Egypt. I wanted to read Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. And it says, this is Joseph talking to his brothers who had previously sold him into slavery, but now Joseph has forgiven them and his brothers have apologized. And Joseph says to them, you planned evil against me. God planned it for good to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. So basically, just like he said, you planned evil against me. Satan may plan evil against us, but God had planned it for good. He has already seen those things coming before he even created the world. He already knew how he was going to turn it around for our good and for his glory. And the next thing that I wanted to move on to was we take this story, but fast forward to the Gospels, where we see kind of a similar story of Jesus, who was a righteous man, where he was God in the form of man, just like we are, had a physical body, had emotions, had hunger and thirst, and he had to walk a lot, so his legs probably hurt. I don't know, but he was a man. He was God in the form of a man. He was both, and I'll do that in a second. But yes, so we see that he came to the earth and he lived a perfect and sinless life that we couldn't, because we had sinned. We deserved death and eternity apart from God. But Jesus came and he was tempted just in the way that we are, yet he never gave into sin. He never sinned against God because he is perfect. Yet he still had the opportunity to, but he didn't. And he subjected himself to the same hurt and suffering that we experience. He experienced sorrow. He experienced laughter. He experienced happiness. He experienced sadness and hurt and betrayal, the same things that we experience. So we are not alone in what we feel, because the God of the entire universe subjected himself to the same thing. And just a little side note from this, I just want to say that he understands where we come from, and he's been there and he's felt that, and he is with us in that. We don't ever experience something that he doesn't understand. I mean, of course he understands he's God, but he's been through it because he came to be with us. And another thing that I wanted to talk about from this is that, and we see this a lot in the Psalms, all throughout the Bible, but a lot of the Psalms are Psalms of lamenting and just pouring out to God of this hurt, or God, where have you gone? Why have you left me? Even though he never left. But we see that our hurt and our suffering increases our dependence on God, which is where we needed to be in the first place, because whenever they were in the garden, they lived in harmony with God and they were completely dependent upon him, which is where we still need to be, but we try to choose to sin and to go off on our own, which is where we don't need to be. That little side tangent. Basically, he understands, he is with us, and our hurt and our suffering increases our dependence upon him and shows that he is the healer, he is the comforter, that he is enough to heal those things. Because the darker that it seems, the brighter that the light is. And so just kind of going back to where we were, he subjected himself to the same hurt that we experience, and he died the death that we deserve and rose again 3 days later. And by that, I mean that because we sin, like I said earlier, we deserve death and eternity apart from God in a place called hell, because the wages of sin is death. We see that in Romans. So Jesus came and he died the death that we deserve, and he was perfect. He didn't deserve that. He shouldn't have, he didn't have to do that for us, but he died on a cross in our place and was buried in a tomb, and he rose again 3 days later, showing that he has the complete power over sin, the complete power over evil. And now that he is risen again, he offers us eternal life, and we can have a relationship with him. He offers us eternal life, and we can have a relationship with him. We can no longer be under the power of sin, because he has defeated it, because he has the full power over evil, and he has conquered it once and for all. And you may say, well, either I have accepted the gospel and I believe in God and I have repented and believed in him, but I still have hardships, I still have trials, I still have temptations. Why, if God already defeated this, why do I still have to go through all this hurt and this pain? And that is a very good question. It's a very real question. That's something that we all struggle with. But again, like I said earlier, is that, and even we see this, like, again, all throughout the Bible, and a lot in, like, James, which is so good, because it says, "Consider it joy, my brothers and sisters, when you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance." And it keeps going, and it's good. I'll put it in the comments so you can go back and read it on your own. I highly encourage you to. But just knowing that our suffering and our hurts and the things that we experience because of sin, because we live in a fallen world, even though we do try to follow God as best as we can, we still experience the effects of sin because there is still sin in the world. That brings us closer to God. Like, personally, I know that when I was going through the hardest times in my life, those are the things that brought me closest to God. Those are the times where I saw him to be enough, where I saw him to be the light that I needed. He shows himself to be enough, and he shows himself to be near to the brokenhearted in those moments, where we have nowhere else to turn but him. So he shows himself to be enough. And kind of one of the final things that I wanted to say is that Jesus defeated sin on the cross, and he also gives us a hope. He gives us eternal life. And if we flip back to Revelation, like to the very end, to Revelation chapter 21, we see that we can have hope, because God says, this is verse 3 and 4, it says, "Then I heard from the throne, a loud voice from the throne, 'Look, God's dwelling is with humanity, and he will live with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them and will be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Grief, crying, and pain will be no more, because the previous things have passed away.'" And this is when God has judged all sin, brought it to judgment, because, again, he will not turn a blind eye to these things. These things will be paid for, and he is a just God, so he will bring justice to these things. But we can also have hope in knowing that there will be a day when all of this will be dealt with in a just way that only God can deal with, and that he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Grief, crying, and pain will be no more, because the previous things have passed away. And he gives us that hope to say, I know it's hard now, but I am with you, and one day these things will be gone. They will be passed away. So he gives us that hope, and that's something to look forward to in our pain, and knowing that our pain does build us up to be closer to him, and that it is only temporary, and that eternal life with God is forever. And so a couple of takeaways that I wanted to say just from this, just little short things, was that, one, humanity chose sin and God allowed it to happen. 2, God brings good out of evil and offers us eternal life through the cross and a relationship with him. 3, God is with us in our suffering, and he understands. He's been through it. 4, God promises there will be a day with no more suffering, and God shows himself to be sovereign over sin, to have complete power over sin, and that he alone can bring this all to where it needs to be. And so I hope that this helps. I hope that this brings you an explanation, but also comfort in the same time. And honestly, if you have any questions, if you want to talk about any other topic, you can just either message me or put it in the comments. I would love to do that. But just know that you are so loved, and I will see you next Friday, friends.